to introduce to the stage Jonny Concannon, who is the Head of Information Security ITS Technology Group, Jonathan Mattey, who is the Head of Cybersecurity for Forge Holiday Group, and Lee Morton, who is the Head of Cybersecurity, I can't even read my own writing, GBG. Welcome, guys.
Good morning.
I'm going to let you decide where you're sitting, Lee.
Sorry, Lee.
There we go. I'm going to start annoying the cameraman now by moving chairs around. Right, welcome, guys. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves in a little minute. But we're going to be talking about the 3 R's of cybersecurity. I'm not even going to give away what the 3 R's are because I'm going to ask you to tell us what they are. And how that's going to impact, in particular, what's coming in the next year. So maybe Jonny number 1.
I like that, Jonny number 1. I'm usually Jonny number 2. So good morning, everybody. I'm Jonny Concannon. I am the Head of Information Security at ITS Technology Group. ITS are a telecoms provider, the 3rd largest fibre provider in the UK. You've probably not heard of us, though. We work business to business. In terms of resilience, that's something that's a key focus for me and the sector that I work in. But yeah, that's something that I'm quite passionate about and want to address today.
Oh.
Yeah, I guess I'm Jonny too.
Jonny.
Somewhat aggrieved to be so. It isn't usually the other way around when we've done panels in the past. I'm Head of Cybersecurity Forge Holiday Group. The largest divisions of part of that group, the travel hospitality sector, are Sykes Cottages, Forest Holidays and UK Caravans for Hire. We've got a big presence based in the UK, but we also have an agency over in New Zealand as well, which is fantastic from my perspective because we get a bit of out-the-box follow the sun when it comes to our SOC environment. I'm going to sort of tackle, for the most part, the risk aspect of the 3 R's, following on from Jonny's take on resilience.
Yes, I'm Lee. I don't have a number, so do I feel special about that? Don't know. So I work for GBG, and I'm Lee 3.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm Head of Cybersecurity at a company called GBG. GBG, we provide entity fraud and location data to organisations, and actually we've got, based on our Wikipedia page, we can identify 4.4 billion people around the world, which is over 50% of the world's population. So as you can imagine, the kind of data we've got is massive, and we provide services to lots of entities, including banks, which is why when we have questions regarding regulations, a lot of those are going to look at me, I guess. But Jonny's got some of those as well.
Which one?
Which? So, this one.
Oh, you meant which regulation?
All right, so I got a list of questions for you, but before I get to them, we're going to go back round. I want to get your perspective to your resilience, risk, regulation. Give me your perspective on why we're here to talk about the 3 R's, and then we'll get into the questions.
Yeah, so I'll kick off on resilience. So with the events of July and obviously the large EDR provider, XDR provider, that caused an outage which was felt globally, and regulation, so DORA, NIS2, in the sector that I work in, the TSA, which is the Telecom Security Act, operational resilience at technology level, process level, but also the resilience of your people is paramount to those things. So resilience for me, with your strategies, with your working programs, should be fundamental, front and centre to that. So yeah, that's why we're talking about resilience.
I'm going to go Lee next. I'm going to mix it up a bit. Sorry.
Yeah, so we provide a lot of services to banks, and there's expectation is they're going to push DORA to us significantly next year. We do actually provide services to some critical infrastructure as well, so we'll have impact from NIST List 2 later on this year. But DORA is the one thing that I can see is going to hit everybody really hard next year. And for me, it's something we need to get out in front of.
Yeah, and I suppose risk I see as something that underpins a lot of the decision-making around how we approach regulation, how we approach resilience, and in a major way, how we communicate that to the business and how we talk in the same language and how we improve the language that we use. I'm a massive advocate of risk quantification over more qualitative methods, and I'll probably touch on that a little bit as part of this conversation as well.
So question for you. So Jonny 1's already talked about that vendor, which we'll just call CrowdStrike, let's be honest. It's a bit easier, isn't it? We all know what we're talking about. I don't know, are they? I'm sure someone is. Don't we love them, honestly? I don't think it causes any impact at all. But that's so, Jonny 2, let's talk about how do you assess likelihood and impact of risk given those kind of system outages that we're talking about?
Yeah, and it's been an interesting one that's come up quite a lot, and the term black swan is used quite a lot in the context of the incident with regards to said EDR provider. And how do you quantify and how do you model for a black swan event? But the reality is what happened with CrowdStrike, it wasn't so much a black swan event because concentration risk has been a thing that's existed for a long time and there's been a lot of risk registers for a long time. So I think the starting point really is to understand the frame of reference for events such as the CrowdStrike outage, understand where you might be exposed for that, i.e. what technologies do we have within our environment that are somewhat ubiquitous in their deployment. How well is your EDR deployed is a question as security leaders we should all have a fairly solid answer for, and we should understand how many of our systems have that EDR provider on, similarly with other technologies. So you've got to first address what the big question is, and it's not so much, what is the chances of CrowdStrike happening again or an EDR event happening again. It's okay, what is the likelihood, what is the probability of a major outage coming as a result of one of our ubiquitous technologies suffering from an incident similar to that of, and that's when you broaden that frame of reference, you have more data then to start making an assessment as to the likelihood of something like this happening again. Because system outages and issues with Microsoft, issues with certain other OSs as well, issues with providers and solutions that have quite high level of access to those OSs, they can cause issues and you can understand where they are. And once you get to that stage, you can identify where they exist within your criticality and start to move towards a resilience plan if in the event that materializes.
I think it was kind of interesting. So I just happened to meet the CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre the following week. So CrowdStrike incident was on the Friday. I met her on the Tuesday. We're already due to have a coffee. What she said on the Friday was Cobra was actually instigated. Now, Cobra is normally for pandemic, those type of national events, if you like. And because we have a new government, everyone's kind of looking at each other a little bit, who's supposed to do this? And even though it technically wasn't a cyber incident, although the update was obviously from a cybersecurity company, what actually highlighted to the government and also to the NCSC in particular is the fragility of the UK's economy and supply chain when you have this kind of ripple effect. You just talked about black swan events, and one of the things that they were reflecting on is the fact that their remit is probably going to change beyond cyber to look at digital resilience and kind of all of those things. So if I can come to you then, Jonny 1. So how does these kind of extreme, but I would sort of say very unlikely events impact the kind of strategy and plan when it comes to resilience and kind of how you're thinking about things?
Yeah, so in terms of the Black Swan event that we've obviously referenced there, I think it depends on the organisation you work for, the budget, all those kind of things. So if you were looking at trying to mitigate that at a technical level or a process level, maybe not everyone's got the ability to stand up separate environments that are not reliant on a CrowdStrike, but where does that stop? Next, it could be a vulnerability management solution, any kind of agent or anything that interacts with that. I think for me, there's making sure that your boards and your senior leadership team are aware of what that could look like and making that quantifiable, as Jonny has talked about. But I think Jonny has got a really good angle on that, and it's looking at what that would look like. So previous events, say it's one in 10 years, for instance, what that would look like per annum, and quantifying that in a monetary manner is definitely possible. Whether it be a percentage or not, it's still a probability that you can factor into a business plan or a strategy. I think when it comes to resilience, like I say, it's going to underpin everything we do. Dora and NIS2, like I say, the TSA for myself, but irrelevant for the regulations, you need to be factoring in your strategies fundamentally how you stay operational when adverse events happen, because they will happen, whether that's 1 in 10 years or once a year. You really need to make sure you put focus on that, and we will be doing it. we layer on technology to make sure we're resilient. But I think the key thing is looking at dependencies, mapping those out, single points of failure, and not forgetting about the resilience of your staff as well when these things happen. I've been part of a large cyber attack. Some of those staff are in the audience today, and being mindful of their resilience and supporting that was really key.
Lee, I know you've got something to say.
Yeah.
Lee's always got something to say.
I think for me, we're saying the words black swan regarding this event at CrowdStrike, but this is not the first time that an antivirus has ate itself or something has caused a problem with an antivirus has affected it. I worked at an MSP when Panda had exactly the same scenario. It's happened previously with other vendors. The problem is we need to look back on what's gone on before and actually put a quantity against it to say, look, this is the damage it could cause, and put something that we can actually say to the board members and say, if this occurred, there's going to be an impact. We have to do that, but we also need to look at what's going to happen regarding that potentially happening again and give them the quantity and say, look, it's a cost. Because one of the biggest issues we've got whenever I try to talk regarding resolving a vulnerability is, we don't want to make these changes because it's going to lose revenue. It's going to affect our bottom line. And unfortunately, when we're talking about security, we're generally talking about a risk based on the number category. And where I honestly believe Jonny is very, very good at is talking about how we can quantify that risk in a money value. And that realistically is what we need to do. We need to move away from talking about risk regarding it's a red risk, it's a critical risk, it's going to be 12 out of 16 on a risk rating, and actually give them a figure. And therefore we can say, look, we've got to bring this downtime, we're going to have these impacts, this is going to be the cost, so we can get resilient systems in there. Because the biggest problem is we can't make those changes because we're afraid of affecting downtime, and we're not being given windows to be able to do this. So for me, we look back on what's gone on before. This kind of thing regarding CrowdStrike, it's happened before with other vendors. We put across saying, look, if this happens, how do we deal with it? One of the first questions I got asked by my CISO was, what would we do in the event of a CrowdStrike happening again? We have to have a plan for that. Because these core systems will fail, we have to have a plan in place. So we need to look at what our core systems are and the impact of them going down and get plans in case it happens again.
And Jonny too, I think you've been queued up very nicely by the other guys in terms of how. Let's talk about, we're talking about, the fact that we need to do all these things. Can you give us some insights onto how you actually quantify these things?
Yeah, it boils down to, what's your expected loss and what's your inherent loss, and how do you actually, I really cannot stand 1 to 5 likelihood and 1 to 5 impact. I just think they're fairly meaningless nominal values that can't be multiplied together and can't actually provide much insight to the business. If you can get to a point where you're assessing, you're providing a confidence range, so you don't have to say, if this happens, it's going to cost us 2.3 million. What you can give them is it's going to cost us in between 500k and 5 million as a confidence interval, and then you can sort of do a sort of log normal distribution on that to come up with an expected loss based on the probability that you assign to it actually potentially occurring. And then you have an expected inherent loss. Then you can start to factor in things like your control efficiencies and using things like we mentioned earlier, the Scientia Institute, data mapping of the most likely threats and the most likely attack vectors that you're going to see alongside things like the Mattey. You can start to understand, okay, well, how much actually does EDR reduce my risk of a ransomware attack on these systems when it's deployed? You might turn around and say, just for ease of figures, you say, right, okay, I believe we get a 10% control efficiency from that. Then you can ask the question, okay, well, how well deployed is it? How well configured is it? I think of an available 10% of reducing the ransomware risk, we're currently realizing between 8 and 9%. When you get to that point, you can start to factor in that control efficiency for the expected loss that you've put for an inherent, then you reduce that to get your inherent loss. And that's when you can turn around to the business and say, these risks can now aggregate, we can put them together. Loss exceedance graphs are far superior to any sort of qualitative matrix that you might use. And if you can start expressing it in that terms, you start having a conversation with the business where you say, we're currently observing a 9.5% chance of a cyber event causing a loss to the business in excess of 5 million. And if you can express it in that terms, then you can decide whether actually it's worthwhile to invest in what would be investing to the point where you've got multiple EDRs, really strong depth and resilience can be extremely expensive. And for some businesses, that might not be a reasonable choice. But if you express it in that term, if you sort of say, right, we've gone from inherent loss through to residual expected loss, we've put that to the business, we've put that in financial terms, the business can then make an informed decision based on your forecasting.
Any comments on that?
No, just rip up your risk registers, basically. Don't use 5x5. That's fundamentally what he's saying. No, it makes sense, and obviously that's a very short explanation into, quite detailed though, into how you can look at risk in a different way. But ultimately, some organisations are huge with a risk methodology that we adhere to. So I just think there's a different way of framing risk, and Jonny does a great job of explaining that.
I think just before I come back to you, Lee, and dive a little bit more into some of the regulations, just another kind of reflection from my conversation with the NCSC as well. Again, although it technically wasn't a cyber incident, the concern is that a threat actor now has a playbook, in essence. For if I want to do impact at scale, particularly across critical infrastructure, I've already seen the art of the possible, in essence. And so there's a real concern that how do we kind of collaborate at scale? And I want to kind of come to you, Lee, and then I'm going to come back to Jonny one about resilience. I just want to kind of dig a little bit more into there. Do you see more regulation coming, and how do you kind of manage that onerous overhead of constant more regulation? We've already got, it's already hard enough, isn't it?
Right, at this point I'm going to shout out to Trish, who's out there and who works with me in GVG. So she's in charge of GRC. So obviously we are having to deal with our customers. They're pushing the regulations to ourselves. We've got limited regulations we must comply with, but our customers are expecting to have that. And the problem is next year for us, we've got DORA coming online, and we have a lot of banks. We deal with services to the banks. I guarantee that as soon as DORA comes online, they come into us and say, are you compliant? And one of the big things inside DORA is there's a commitment that we must do more testing than anything we've ever done before. And these testings will include the likelihood that we will get breached. So we have to go into it as a threat actor is targeting us. One of the things that they state inside the scenario with DORA is the fact that we do a red team once every 3 years. Now, if we do a real red team, highly likely we're going to be compromised. So that's a total change regarding what we're doing at the moment from pen testing. Because a lot of times we're doing pen testing, we're demonstrating that we are protected from attacks. In this scenario, we know we're going to have a breach because the red teamer will find a way into our network. What we are trying to demonstrate is how long we can keep them out against a sustained attack. It's going to be a massive change for organisations, I believe, over the next couple of years with DORA and also with NIS2, which... going off of what we said before, all of us are impacted by NIS2 in this. We all have different roles, but we have customers that are going to be pushing these regulations to us. So I think those two, NIS2 comes on in the next few months.
I think it depends on the implementing sort of law that will come. So I think where it impacts us is in Ireland, which is they're due to sort of release some notes on implementation in Ireland in October. Sort of around that period of time. So we're keeping an eye on what the implementing law is going to say. I mean, the big change for, because I worked for a CNI prior to my current role, and it nearly took us by surprise, NIS2, because they've broadened the scope of what's included and companies that come under the remit quite aggressively, because originally NIS was focused on CNI, whereas now there's a lot of the digital infrastructure that falls into the NIS2, including online marketplaces, which is what Sykes is as one of the divisions of Forge. So we've had to review the requirements that have come in as part of NIS2. Now I've often believed regulation. If you have a security function, security regulations are fairly reactive. You should be doing a lot of the things that are specified as part of it anyway, but where the impact comes in for businesses that fall into scope that haven't necessarily invested in security to this point, that's where they'll start to say, okay, this is something we need to look at in earnest now. We need to put some investment there. But certainly from my perspective, the broader scope of NIS2 and keeping an eye on those implementation laws and the testing requirements that come with it, the sort of the specificity of the requirements that come with NIS2, but equally the accountability changes, because we have to advise the board on what they're going to be accountable for, because there's some shifts there with NIS2 as well.
And I think that shift's the big thing, because although we're saying at the moment that we're compliant, soon enough those changes, if we're not watching it, are going to hit us and will impact us. And at that point, our customers are saying, actually, we don't want to buy products from you. So, you know, realistically, we've got to be kept current with these kind of regulations that are going to impact us. So for me, you don't just think now, you have to think of what's coming on in the next 2 years.
So thank you. We're nearly out of time, but I want to give each person, I just say I was going to come to Jonny 1 as well for reflection. So how do you convince the board that they're still making the investment in the right area and that the resilience is still in the right place, given how complex everything is?
Well, it's quite straightforward for me because I've got a regulation to adhere to, contractual obligations with telcos, etc., that make it a lot easier. But fundamentally, you need to light that risk up for them in a way that Jonny has articulated perfectly. Make it about the crowd strikes, make it about the regulation, and make it about what the impact of that business is. Use EBITDA, use downtime from your critical systems. You can monetize that. I'm probably preaching to the converted anyway here. But yeah, fundamentally, resilience is being underpinned in regulation for a reason. It's what we all should be doing, but it depends on the scale of technical controls and process to be able to mitigate it.
So thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Sorry.
Jonny 1, Jonny 2, Lee 3, thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you very much.
Get your insight.